and you thought my skin couldn't get paler. Hello, good morning, and welcome to Library Scented Life. If you're new here, my name is Sydney. Thank you so much for coming to my channel, and let's get right into it. So today I am adding to my History of Genres series. If you haven't seen my history of the fantasy genre, I will link that up there and down below for you to go watch. And since it's October, I figured the next one I should do is the history of horror literature. So I'm going to be talking about prominent books and pieces of writing that really shaped how we see horror literature today, and the different tropes and how people write scary things, and as well as the different subgenres and how they came to be. So we are going to start in ancient Greece and Rome, where a lot of folklore centered around death and the afterlife, and as well as demons, was very prevalent. A lot of it was religious and tradition based, and there were a lot of fears about the dead rising and things like that, and different things to do to prevent that from happening. So horror written works in the medieval era were more religious based. There was a lot of worry about people practicing Satanism and about being possessed, so there were also a lot of written works on how to tell whether someone's possessed and what to do, and different instructive things. So that wasn't really horror fiction, but horror fiction was written based on people's fears, so I felt that it was important to put that in there because depending on the fears of the generation, that's how the writing was formed. In the 12th century, a book called Bisclavret by Marie de France was written, and it was probably the first published werewolf story. So this was about a man trapped in his werewolf form due to the treachery of his wife. I'm not sure what that entails exactly, but that was the first written works of werewolves, and it actually inspired many others after it. In 1235, the Vatican ordered re-establishment of the orthodoxy of faith, and therefore accusations of witchcraft began, and that went until the 1700s. And with the accusations of witchcraft came books on how to defend your home from witchcraft and on how to spot it, just like with the Satanism. Therefore, books playing on these fears were published. In 1307, Dante published his Divine Comedy, the portion specifically Inferno, which dealt with the afterlife in hell and what that might look like, and it dealt with torture, and it was considered gory, and that was almost considered a horror read as a warning. The church was behind it in support, so that people would be scared into acting as the church wanted. So this went on for a while, where most of the horror was church-based and scaring people into religion, until the 1580s, when we go into gruesome stage plays and scripts. So some of these include The Spanish Tragedy by Thomas Kyd in 1585, and some of Shakespeare's works such as Hamlet and Macbeth had a lot of gore and blood on stage, and these were considered demonic plays because they were the first to portray horror in a non-religious aspect, and more just so the gore was the reason people were drawn into the play, because it was something they had never seen before as a pretend thing, as opposed to wars and real-life gruesome ideals. Jumping into 1714, we saw the rise of graveyard poets, also called churchyard poets. So their poems were about mortality and about death and loss and different forms of grief, and this was before the Romantic poetry revolution. So before romance, we were in the graveyards, and that played a big part in the horror genre as a whole because it was talking about mortality as man's greatest fear. Now, in my History of Fantasy video, I talked about The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, and that is relevant here as well because it was the first in the Gothic genre. The Gothic genre is considered the mother of horror, thrillers, the supernatural, paranormal romances, anything like that, because it was the first thing to involve human fears with unnatural elements and to combine them to scare the reader. Now, The Castle of Otranto was a ghost story that takes place in a castle, and it inspired many castle and mansion-inspired ghost stories, which went on for a while as the only ghost stories. Now, going back to the stage, from 1790 to 1825, we had a vampire phase. So this was nicknamed the Vampire Trap, and it was kind of like the Twilight phase where everyone was obsessed with vampires, except this was on stage. Now, these shows involved a lot of gore and a lot of blood and sexual deviance, and the church hated it, as you could probably guess. It was a whole phase of people being obsessed with vampires, and therefore not only scripts but literature came out of it. Now, moving into the 19th century, we saw a big switch between Gothic and horror. Horror was becoming its own thing, separating itself from the Gothic genre, which included many classic tropes that horror was moving away from. An example of this is that in 1880, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley came out, and that was a combination of Gothic Gothic and sci-fi, and this is actually considered the mother of sci-fi by some people, and because it was the first one to include an element of pseudoscience. Going more into horror than Gothic, in 1820 Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving was released. In 1827 we had an introduction to Edgar Allan Poe with his first poetry collection, and that was called Tamerlane and Other Poems, and Edgar Allan Poe, along with E.T.A. Hoffmann, actually raised the Gothic genre to touch on everyday people and everyday lives by combining things like reason and madness, and talking about the psychological aspects of the mind of selves and others, as well as using easily read and interpreted symbolism that people could use in their everyday lives without meaning to. For this example, I would talk about someone reading The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe and then seeing a raven and associating it with that and the fear involved in that poem, so people were thinking about the stories long after they had finished reading them. So the 1830s brought penny bloods, also known as penny dreadfuls, and these were kind of the horror version of dime novels. So penny dreadfuls were basically cheap novels that were printed on flimsy paper as to be disposable. So these were actually published because the working class had more time to read with commuting time and trains, so more books came out to accommodate this. So penny dreadfuls as well as dime novels normalized fictitious reading for adults as opposed to just something that was allowed for children. It also normalized the lower and working classes learning to read and being literate. So where dime novels were more fantasy and sci-fi and westerns, penny dreadfuls were all horror and mysteries and thrillers. So from penny dreadfuls we actually got the story of Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, which is of course a Broadway musical and has a very successful movie, and the story was originally called String of Pearls and was originally written by James Malcolm Rymer and Thomas Peckett Prest. In 1831 we got The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo, which analyzed that everyone has a dark side and the different choices that everyone makes and which is considered evil and good depending on your perspective. In 1863 Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu brought us The House by the Churchyard, and he specialized in fictitious paranormal writing at that time and also released a story called Green Tea. In 1868 we got The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, which was an unsettling mystery detective novel and combined aspects of horror and mystery and kind of made that subgenre a little bit. In 1886 we got Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. So going into 1888 we saw the beginning of fictionalized serial killer stories as horror stories. This was actually the same year that Jack the Ripper murders were recorded, and people had a new fear that they had never had before because serial killers weren't known. A work called The Curse Upon Mitre Square by John Francis Brewer was published, and it actually featured the real name of one of Jack the Ripper's first victims, and it was published the same year that she was murdered, so it was very insensitive, but it was the first of its kind to talk about serial killers in a book. This inspired other stories featuring Jack the Ripper, and as new serial killers came over the years, there was a rise in the trend of writing about serial killers every time. In 1896 we saw the introduction of pulp fiction magazines. Very similar to Penny Dreadful, they were cheap, and these were actually printed on wood pulp paper, so each magazine actually featured multiple stories with various gothic and horror themes such as ghost stories, murders, mysteries, as well as combinations of genres that later separated into their own. In 1897 Bram Stoker published Dracula, which later turned into many different novels and movie adaptations and re-inspired the vampire era of novels. In 1910 a serialized novel called Le Fantôme de l'Opéra by Gaston Leroux was released, which would of course later become the musical Phantom of the Opera, as well as inspire full novels instead of serialized. Moving into 1931, ghost stories were revolutionized by M.R. James. Previous to M.R. James, ghost stories followed the same premise as the Castle of Otranto, in which it always took place in a mansion or in a castle, but M.R. James made a new formula that allowed ghosts to be anywhere, so people would fear them being in their beach houses and in their workplaces, at their own houses, and in items themselves. M.R. James was one of the first writers to write stories about someone touching an object or finding it and then that awakening a ghost or a demon that haunts them or their house. So M.R. James revolutionized the idea that ghosts could be anywhere and took it out of that rigid structure of the Castle of Otranto and made it so the reader doesn't know what to expect next because fears can be everywhere. In the 1940s we were introduced to EC Comics, and they specialized in horror, crime, satire, military fiction, and science fiction. And this comic actually brought us the Tales of the Crypt series, which later turned into a really popular popular TV shows in the 90s, and most of the stories were actually drawn from those comics. In 1959, Robert Bloch was inspired to write and publish Psycho, and he was inspired by real-life serial killers at the time. Similarly to this, 10 years later, the Manson family murders inspired a rush of slasher movies and slasher book, and this went on from 1970 to 1981. So this success rate of serial killer books really shows how people writing about the modern fears really sell the most and really connect most with the audience. Just like moving ghost stories to the common home as opposed to a mansion connected to the readers more because the working class was reading horror. In the 1970s, horror became more familiar to what we know now, and we were introduced to Stephen King with Carrie, and the 1970s was also the start of really looking into the minds of the characters and knowing their inner workings and why they do what they do, as well as the introduction of thriller as a separate genre, as well as twist endings becoming more popular. In the 1980s, The Woman in Black by Susan Hill was published, and that actually became a movie with Daniel Radcliffe a bit later on. In the 1990s, horror books and movies were so popular that people weren't scared of them anymore, so a lot of the writers stepped up their game and came out with really unique ideas. One of these unique ideas was catering horror stories to children. This sparked the Goosebumps book series by R.L. Stine, and horror became popular among children, and nowadays children tend to watch horror movies meant for adults and aren't even fazed because we are so accustomed to all the horror media over the years. For example, reading an Edgar Allan Poe story might have been very terrifying when it was written, but now I don't think it would actually be scary for most people because it usually doesn't connect with us as much as modern day horror would. So today we have horror and many subgenres of horror such as thrillers and paranormal, even paranormal romances. Descriptions and reviews are very easily accessible, so we know what we're looking for and what we want to read and what we're about to read, and therefore we can pick our level of being scared. There are many unique horror books, there are many horror trope books, and in conclusion, horror has become one of the biggest genres in media in general because everyone likes to be scared a little bit sometimes. So that is the end of the history of horror. Obviously, I had to leave stuff out, but I put what I thought was very relevant to the horror genre, and I put as many as I could in. So like and subscribe if you liked it, and if you want to, leave me a comment down below letting me know what genre I should research and talk about next. And also let me know what is your favorite horror movie or horror book. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm so excited to see you in my next video. Bye!